Hey guys, tonight, we're going to drift back into a season that medieval peasants both dreaded and endured with the grace of people who had no other choice. That's right, winter. So, dim the lights, settle into your blanket, and let's shuffle quietly into the chilly, smoky, and slightly damp homes of peasants who were just trying to make it to spring without freezing, starving, or losing their minds from boredom. Now, you might think of medieval winter as some kind of cozy cottagecore dream. A flickering fire, bread baking in the oven, people wrapped in while cloaks sipping something warm. Yeah, no. For peasants, winter was less about hot cocoa and more about survival with whatever scraps they'd managed to hoard during the harvest months. And if you're picturing fresh bread every day, remember, grain storage wasn't exactly airtight. We're talking stale bread, dried peas, and probably some unidentifiable lumps that may or may not have been food. But let's start at the beginning of winter, right after the harvest. Autumn had been busy. Fields cleared, crops stored, animals butchered for salting or smoking, and every possible edible thing shoved into pits, barns, or clay jars. By December, all the hard outdoor labor slowed down. Which sounds great, right? Except peasants didn't exactly have hobbies, Netflix, or heated yoga to fill the time. Winter was long, cold, and dark. Inside the typical peasant house, think single room, mud floor, smoke wafting from a central hearth, life became claustrophobic. Families crammed together, sometimes with their animals. Yes, sheep and cows got the ultimate VIP pass inside. Not because peasants were sentimental, but because livestock gave off warmth. Imagine falling asleep next to your snoring cousin and a steaming cow at the same time. Cozy. Now, what did people do all day? Well, first, sleep, and lots of it. Without electric light, the rhythm of life followed the sun. Nights stretched up to 14 hours in Northern Europe, which meant long periods of rest. But this wasn't straight 8-hour blocks. Historians actually talk about first sleep and second sleep. People would drift off early, wake up around midnight, maybe pray, talk, even visit neighbors if they were feeling particularly lively, and then drift into a second round of sleep before dawn. Essentially, they had the world's first documented segmented sleep schedule. When not sleeping, peasants turned to the slower, indoor chores that kept them alive. Women spun wool or flax into thread. Men repaired tools, patched up carts, or carved little wooden things that might be sold at the market come spring. Everyone had a task. And because winters were long, these chores were less about productivity and more about sanity. A spinning wheel wasn't just practical, it was the medieval equivalent of doom scrolling. Something to keep the hands busy while the mind wandered. Food preparation was also a daily ritual. Grain had to be ground, which usually meant trudging to the mill. But in midwinter, that wasn't always possible. So peasants made do with whatever they'd stored. Porridges, stews, hard cheese, salted meat, and, when times got really desperate, bread made with fillers like acorns or tree bark. Delicious. Of course, there was also alcohol. Ale brewing happened year-round, but in winter, it played an important role. Water wasn't always safe, so small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew, was the everyday drink. It was hydrating, slightly nourishing, and just enough to make life feel less bleak when your toes were numb and your breath turned into fog inside your own house. Let's float over now to another part of peasant winter life, community and celebration. Because as grim as this all sounds, people still found ways to make it tolerable. So we've got peasants huddled inside with their families, animals, and ale, trying not to freeze or lose their minds. But winter wasn't just endless spinning wheels and stale bread. It also came with moments of celebration, because if you're going to be trapped in a smoky hut, you might as well break out the good mead now and then. The biggest event of winter? Christmas. Or more broadly, the midwinter festival season, which mixed older pagan customs with the Christian calendar. For peasants, this was less about deep theology and more about a rare chance to actually have fun. Feasts, church services, songs, and a lot of drinking. Even the poorest villages tried to scrape together something special. Maybe a goose, maybe a little extra honey, maybe just stronger ale than usual. Think of it as the medieval version of office holiday parties, except the boss was your local lord, and instead of awkward karaoke, you might just get yelled at for not paying your rent. And then there was Twelfth Night. Long before it was a Shakespeare play, It was a topsy-turvy celebration where social roles could flip. Servants might mock their masters, men dressed as women, and villagers crowned a mock lord of misrule. Basically, medieval people invented chaotic winter cosplay centuries before Comic-Con. But most days weren't festival days. Entertainment in the long months of January and February came in smaller doses. Storytelling was huge. People sat around the fire and retold folktales, legends, or just gossiped endlessly about the neighbors. And gossip, well, it was practically a survival tool. If everyone in your village lived within a stone's throw of each other, what else was there to talk about? Who's hoarding grain, whose daughter ran off, and which cow mysteriously stopped producing milk? Cozy, right? Board games and dice also made appearances. Simple pastimes like Nine Men's Morris or Knucklebones, which were literally animal bones used like dice, gave peasants something to fiddle with when their hands weren't spinning wool. It wasn't glamorous, but it filled the hours between one dark morning and the next darker evening. Now, let's address the elephant, or maybe the coughing goat, in the room: sickness. Winter was peak season for it. Cold, damp houses, bad nutrition, and people packed in tightly together meant illness spread easily. Colds, fevers, stomach problems, you name it. And since medical care usually consisted of rest and maybe some herbs, people often just hoped their immune system or their prayers would get the job done. Fun fact, one popular remedy for winter coughs involved mixing honey with onion juice, which is about as pleasant as it sounds. Peasants also leaned on religion heavily during winter. When food supplies got low or illness lingered, prayers, blessings, and church rituals filled the gaps that medicine and diet couldn't. The village church was not only a spiritual hub but also a social one. Even in the darkest months, people gathered there, both for worship and for the faint relief of seeing other faces besides your immediate family and livestock. Another interesting rhythm of winter life was weddings. Believe it or not, January was considered a prime time to get married. Harvest was done, there was a lull in work, and people were looking for an excuse to gather, eat, and drink. So, if you imagine peasants trudging through snow in their best woolen cloaks, heading to church for a winter wedding, you're not far off. And yes, those weddings could turn into days-long parties. Because when survival is tough, you celebrate whenever you can. And finally, let's not forget about one underrated winter pastime: complaining. Chroniclers and parish priests occasionally wrote about peasants grumbling during the cold season. Too much snow, not enough firewood, food stores going bad. It was the medieval version of posting a rant online. Except instead of Twitter, you just muttered it to whoever happened to be sitting on the next straw mat. So, when we imagine medieval peasants in winter, the picture is a mix. Yes, there was hardship, hunger, and sickness. But there was also storytelling, feasting, prayer, and community. They endured together in smoky houses with noisy animals and too many relatives, because the only other option was isolation, and isolation in the Middle Ages usually meant death. And with that, our little tour of medieval winter is winding down. So next time you complain about your heating bill or Wi-Fi cutting out, just remember, at least you're not making onion syrup in a freezing hut while your neighbor's cow sneezes in the corner.